Terminal.
RCP chamber pressure looks good. Following up. Roger, roll, Atlantic.
Water towers can fly! Yes!
Tango Delta nominal.
Flighting outside speed off. Bring in, speed off. Off. Yikes. You bet. Concur. We don't need any more of these.
All right, folks, good morning. You know the drill. It's time for another internet rocket launch here today. John Galloway for NASASpaceflight, bringing you some live commentary and Q&A like we do on the NASASpaceflight channel here this morning. And I've got some friends with me. First, let me know if you can hear us and see the view from the Cape, 5x5 in chat. Y'all are doing it before I even have to say it. Very well trained. Thank you for the help there. But without further ado, back in the studio today with me, I have Mr. Thomas Berghardt. Thomas, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, Dus. Looking forward to yet another Starlink mission, yet another Falcon 9 launch, SpaceX's 10th launch of the year already here in March.
No kidding. What is it, 10 divided by 3? Well, it's not even all the way through March yet, so I don't know if you should divide by 3, but one way or the other, that's a lot of launches for a
Yeah,
SpaceX.
we're averaging more than one launch a week already.
That is not a bad problem to have if you like seeing rockets launch. Also, out in the field this morning, we have Mr. Chris Gebhardt, Assistant Managing Editor for NASASpaceflight. Chris, we have you on comms?
You do indeed. Good morning, Das, and good morning, Thomas. It's a wonderful morning for a liftoff.
Excellent. How's the weather out there this morning? It looks a little hazy, maybe.
So yeah, that's a little artifact of the camera, actually. It's not all that hazy outside. It's just sometimes early morning you can get this weird thing when you're looking right at the horizon where it looks hazy, but it's actually a crystal clear sky for us, and an 80% chance of acceptable weather conditions today. So nothing from weather-wise looks like it will impede, at least from a launch weather perspective here in Florida.
Excellent. Well, we are certainly looking forward to the launch happening here in just under 40 minutes. We've ticked past 39 minutes now. Hey, also out in the field, not on comms, but out in the field shooting some photos today, we've also got Mr. Stephen Marr. You've heard his voice on our streams before. We don't expect to hear from him verbally today, but he's out there going to be taking some photos. So make sure you follow him over on Twitter at SpaceCode for some early shots there after the launch hopefully occurs here in about 38 minutes. But without further ado, you know the drill on our streams. We like to answer questions. We do live Q&A for you. So if you've got questions for us, tag us in chat at NASASpaceflight, and the team will field some questions. Let's go ahead and get started there with just talking about today's mission. There's some random number of Starlink satellites aboard, Thomas. Why do they keep switching this number up so much?
Yeah, that's been a number they've adjusted a couple times here and there for a bunch of different reasons. Today's mission is flying 48 Starlink satellites, and the mission is the Group 4-10 mission. That's the actual designation. So going to that fourth shell that SpaceX has been working on filling recently, and that number has been adjusted a couple times for various insertion orbits, being the primary factor. Falcon 9 is flying southeast from Cape Canaveral today, and because of that, there is a slight dogleg maneuver to avoid overflying the Bahamas, and so the slight performance hit for that maneuver causes a bit of a reduction in the satellites they can fly versus a more optimal northeast trajectory. Well, I don't think we've ever actually gotten an official answer from SpaceX as to why that trajectory has been used a few times now. It is expected or predicted that it was a result of recovery weather conditions being a little more favorable in the southern Atlantic versus the northern Atlantic. However, based on some of the drone ship position filings and things for upcoming missions, we actually believe this will be the last launch in a while that will fly southeast. It looks like they're going back to that more standard northeast trajectory with the next Starlink mission after this. So might see a couple more satellites on the next mission. They've also tweaked it by like 1 or 2 satellites recently based on the effects of that geomagnetic storm that hit a new batch of Starlink satellites not that long ago, inserting the satellites into a bit of a higher orbit to avoid any effects of solar activity like that, which means just a few less satellites on each individual launch. So we'll have to see what number they go to when they go back to that northeast trajectory. But that's why that number of satellites has been fluctuating just a little bit as SpaceX kind of fine-tunes how exactly they're deploying satellites on each mission.
Excellent. So again, y'all, get us going here with chat. Get some questions for us. We got a super chat, it looks like, from Michelle Pierce saying, "Morning, y'all." Thank you, Michelle, for the support there. And I'm going to see if I can't start grabbing some of these questions out of chat just like we do. Here was one that actually Thomas just answered. Which direction is this Falcon 9 going after they lift off? That was that southeasterly.
Yeah.
Southeasterly. I mean, what's the right way to say that?
Yes,
Southeast.
it's not due
South.
east. It's not, a geostationary mission or anything, but they are targeting about a 53-degree inclination as always. So it is south-southeast.
Excellent. So good questions there. I am going to continue grabbing. Oh, Thomas, you want to do it or should I do it?
Oh gosh, did we get the question?
Yeah, we got the question.
You can take this one if you want.
Maybe Chris. Chris, do you want the question?
I'll take the question. The
It's like
four
a hot
towers
potato.
the four towers around the rocket are our lightning protection powers. You wouldn't need them today because there's no electrical activity to speak of, but in our summertime months and actually overnight leading up to this, we had a line of we had a line of strong storms come through overnight associated with a frontal system and some summertime that we're actually having here in Florida right now. So you would have needed them overnight to protect the rocket and protect the Starlink satellites that are on board today. But right now, with the weather cleared, we don't need them. But basically, they would take lightning strikes and channel them harmlessly to the ground, protecting the rocket and the pad systems.
You know what somebody needs to come up with, Chris?
Ooh, what?
They need to come up with a wind tower that the wind hits instead of the camera. That would be nice. Is it a little windy?
It's a little windy, yeah. Just a little bit, yeah.
Okay. Good deal. Let me keep getting some other questions here. Oh, when was the last time this booster flew? That's a good question.
It is
known for reusing their boosters. What has this booster done before?
Yeah, so this one is actually making its fourth flight today. It previously flew as the Falcon Heavy Sidecore on Arabsat 6A and STP 2 back in 2019, and then it didn't fly for a very long time. And then in January, it was hauled back out of pseudo-retirement, and it was used to launch the CSG Cosmos SkyMed second generation 2 satellite into a sun-synchronous polar orbit for the Italian Space Agency. So it has been just over a month since this particular booster flew, making its fourth flight today. This is the first time it will actually land in the sea on the autonomous spaceport drone ships. All three of its previous landings were back to LZ-1 or LZ-2 here at Cape Canaveral. And I can sense the next question that's coming, that if this one launched for the last time on January 31st and it's March 8th, does it break the record? The answer is no. It does not break the record. The turnaround record is currently 27 days for a Falcon 9 booster, and we are sitting just in the mid-30 range for this particular one from January to now. So not a record, but still very, very fast turnaround for this booster.
Excellent. Coming up on about 30 minutes here, folks, 32 minutes. If you're just joining us, we're standing by live from Cape Canaveral for the launch of a Falcon 9. Of course, that's going to be SpaceX. And they've got some of those Starlink internet satellites on board. Which Starlinks are we launching now? Have we gotten to like Starlink version 8, or do they have space lasers, or where is SpaceX at in the versions of the satellites that they're putting out?
Yeah, so these Starlinks are the, I guess they're not quite version 2, because version 2 is kind of the version that's supposed to be optimized for Starship. This is like sort of along the lines of version 1.5. They incorporated some upgrades from the first complete shell that SpaceX launched. They are starting to get into having the inner satellite laser links on board, but this isn't the fully updated version. That's kind of an iteration between the two. But these are upgraded Starlink satellites for this Shell 4 that they're calling it.
shell for. Let's talk about that real quick. I mean, we keep saying like, oh, shell, filling out the shell, launching satellites to the shell. What does that mean? Like,
Yeah. So the Starlink constellation will actually eventually consist of 5 different shells, and those are different groups of satellites that service different regions. The first shell that was launched with the missions that were kind of designated the Starlink version 1L whatever, and there were I think 28 of those missions. Was the very first shell filled. That was also at about a 53-degree inclination and an altitude of about 550 kilometers, circular orbits. And that was the first shell to be completely filled, over 1,500 satellites in that plane, or in that shell, excuse me. There has been one or two, I think only one, launch into the second shell, Shell 2, which was a 70-degree inclination orbit that was launched from Vandenberg. They only launched one mission there to start testing out the satellites in that kind of orbit, but otherwise they really have been focusing on the fourth shell, which is what they've been launching into recently. Over 400 satellites in that shell now. It will be another 1,500 plus once that shell is complete, and it is again at a 53-degree inclination at a 540-kilometer altitude. So basically offering more bandwidth at the same kind of ground coverage level as the previous shell. You reach the same latitudes as the first shell, but by adding twice as many satellites, you have twice as much bandwidth. But anyways, so that's the shell that they're working on now. The third shell and fifth shell are both at 97.6-degree inclinations. And those are truly polar orbits, and there are actually 3 Starlink satellites that are active in the third shell that were launched as rideshare payloads on transporter missions, but no dedicated missions to those inclinations for Starlink just yet. Overall, it is worth noting that this mission will bring the total number of active satellites across all of the shells to over 2,000 satellites, which is a milestone that no satellite constellation has ever reached before. So Starlink actually setting a record in that regard today.
that's actually a good lead on to another question here. Darren Reichel asks, how many dedicated Starlink launches will this make? Because we're all like, oh, SpaceX has so many launches, et cetera, but how many of those launches are Starlink versus other customer NASA flights, et cetera?
Well, that's going to get a little dicey to. I guess what's the question actually asking? Like dedicated Starlink missions, because there have been rideshare missions that Starlinks have gone on. There have also been Starlink missions that other satellites have hitched a ride on. All told, this is about number 42 for Starlink altogether, accounting the test flights, the ones that have gone on transporter missions, and the so-called dedicated ones that get the Starlink name on them. It's about 42 is what we're at today.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think like any mission where Starlink is the primary payload, like if there's a couple little ride shares or something like that, that's another thing. It's like the ride share wouldn't be sharing the ride if the Starlinks weren't going in the first place. Right.
Yeah. So I think answering it that way, it's 39 today. And then you had the 2 PAWs that went on a ride share, and then you had about 20 Starlinks that went on 2 transporter ride shares.
Gotcha. All right. As always, a good question, but the answer is sometimes it depends on questions like that. Let's see here. Oh, this is a good one. Mandy asks, could Falcon Heavy launch more Starlinks? Why don't they just fly Falcon Heavies instead of the regular single-stick Falcons?
Absolutely. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so in many ways, it comes down to the what you can fit inside the payload fairing and what's the most economical sense. So could you potentially pack 60 Starlink version 1.5s into the fairing, because they reduce the number because on these from 60 down to 48, 49, like Thomas was saying, because of mass and where you're going and dogleg maneuvers. But if you were to put Falcon Heavy, right, that A limits you to pad A. It then means you have to have 3 first stages for each particular mission. You have to be worried about recovering all of them. This is of something else going, not going particularly correct rise in that regard. And basically, it's not worth it to end up using a Falcon Heavy from a cost perspective for the Starlink satellites. Whereas just reducing the number down but salvoing them off on Falcon 9s, it works for now. And then, of course, Elon has also said that Starship will be instrumental in continuing to build out the Starlink constellation once it is ready for flight operations.
Gotcha. Let's see here. Again, I'm just going through a lot of questions here. Thomas, if you see a question or there's something you want to jump in with, or Chris, same difference there. I am just getting as many chat questions as we can. A couple.
We can. Yeah, go ahead, Dust.
Yeah, go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, I was just going to point out we should also overview the recovery plan for today. As always, with these standard Starlink missions, it is a drone ship recovery mission. And the drone ship on task for today is a shortfall of gravitas, which is out downrange. Of course, and that was tugged by, wait a second, I'm going to make sure I get the right boat because it's either Bob or Doug. I'm pretty sure it's Doug. It is Doug. Doug was the ship to tow out the drone ship, and then we'll go a little bit farther downrange and serve as the fairing recovery vessel for today. So both the first stage and the fairings plan to be recovered for today's mission. As we mentioned before, the booster on this mission is 1052 of 2 Falcon Heavy mission fame, as well as the CSG-2 RTLS mission, which also means that this booster is making its first ever drone ship landing. It's come back to return to the ground pads 3 times in a row, but we'll actually be making a downrange recovery today. No word from SpaceX on the status of the fairings, whether they're reused or not today, so we don't know for sure, but either way, they will be attempted to recover today and hopefully fly again on a future mission.
All right. A couple of super chats and stuff like that came in here. Michael Ox, thank you so much for becoming a Red Team member. And then Rough Rider Show says, pretty good chance we'll have Falcon Heavy launches with SLS in the background. That's another thing that's coming up here down at the Cape, the SLS, the purported SLS rollout, isn't it?
That will probably be the next big event at the Cape, I would think.
It is the next big event at the Cape, yes. It is Thursday the 17th is rollout, planned for 6 p.m. in the evening. About an 11-hour roll for hard down at the pad on Friday morning the 18th around 5 or 6 a.m. local. Yep.
Now, I would not characterize it as a good chance we have a Falcon Heavy launch while SLS is at the pad. SLS will be at the pad for a couple weeks for its wedge race stuff, and as far as we know, Falcon Heavy is not yet ready for its next launch. Well, I shouldn't say that. The rocket may be ready. I don't believe the entire mission overall, including the payload, is slated to actually occur in those few weeks, to be very clear.
Even though we may not see a Falcon Heavy launch with SLS on the pad, there's a really high probability we'll see today's launch with another booster back there in the port. So we may be able to get a shot at 2 Falcon 9 boosters in one camera angle here. This, of course, is our fleet cam over at Rusty Seafood and Oyster Bar at Port Canaveral. This camera's up 24/7, and they've been processing that booster since it came in a couple days ago. So SLS, Falcon Heavy, that's one thing. But today we may get a little bit of a treat here with a rocket, Falcon 9 launching in the background, with the Falcon 9 being processed in the foreground over here on fleet cam. You can actually see the sky up above is blue, but if you look down low, you got that distant cloud layer there that's causing that sort of gray, hazy effect off in the distance. But still looking like a great day out there, right, Chris?
It is indeed.
All right.
That fleet cam view might get us like 2/3 of a Falcon Heavy if you think about it.
2/3 of a
I mean, you got you'll have 2 first stages. You'll have an upper stage of fairing. You know, you're missing a nose cone on the one booster, and you're missing the other booster. So, like, maybe slightly less than 2/3. I don't know.
It's the odd asymmetric thrust Falcon medium that's up.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that would actually be very interesting to fly. SpaceX, I dare you. You won't. Let's see here. Here's another great question from Father Peter J. Shaw. How many boosters are in the active fleet right now?
Ooh, boy. Hold on. Let me pull up the list.
Quick, Google. Yep.
So, active boosters in the SpaceX fleet right now. 1049 is currently slated for, or being prepared for its next mission. 1051 as well as an active booster. This is, of course, 1052, so we're up to 3. If you are willing to count 1053, the other Falcon Heavy side booster, which is not officially retired or anything, we're not sure when it will fly next, whether it'll be used as a Falcon Heavy booster, get converted, or be retired. Haven't heard officially or anything, but the booster has not been outright retired so far, so that gets us to 4. And then a bunch of other Falcon 9s are 1058, 1060, 1061, 1062, 1063 is active. So what are we up to? 5, 6, 7, 8. That gets us up to 9. And then we can add 1067, 1069, and 1071. So we're up to 12 active boosters right now. There are other boosters that we've seen get through McGregor and be prepared for their various missions. We know the Falcon Heavy hardware for the next mission, USSF-44, is out there and ready, but I'm not sure you declare it active until that first launch campaign actually rolls out and things. So as far as boosters that have actually flown and are being prepared for their next flights, we're up to 12 boosters.
12 boosters. Do we know, are they continuing to make more boosters? Like, what's the status of that? Is it, okay, every 3 months they make another booster because they retire some? Have they stopped making new boosters? Like, what's going on there?
They are definitely still making new boosters. In fact, the newest vehicle to arrive at McGregor, which we are based on just the numbering and the boosters that have come before it, we believe is 1073. Actually, from observing, it looks like a brand new Falcon 9, not any Falcon Heavy hardware or anything. So that booster, which will at some point experience the T-minus 20-minute event that we're seeing on our screen now. That was a weird segue, but I had to draw attention to it because it's the rule. So a new Falcon 9 did actually just arrive at McGregor to start its testing, so still making new boosters to expand the fleet. But this booster, 1052, slated with today's launch, is happy inventing on pad 40. Of course, that is the completely nominal vent that occurs at just about T-minus 20 minutes they purge the lines in that transporter erector to switch from filling the upper stage with RP1 kerosene to filling it with liquid oxygen. And they use the same kind of systems for that, so they have to purge the lines between the two different fueling procedures on that upper stage. But that vent has occurred right on time, indicating we are on track for launch at 8:45 a.m. local time.
Well, and that's coming up in just under 20 minutes now, y'all. So if you're joining us less than 20 minutes before the launch, well, I was going to say launch window, but this is a Starlink launch. Just one shot here today, not like a big 3 or 4 hour window, right, Thomas?
Yep, correct. Instantaneous window today.
Excellent. So that is coming up in just about 18, 19 minutes here if you want to stick around. If you need a drink or breakfast or something like that, don't know what time it is where you're watching from, but you might want to do that now so that you don't miss the launch coming up here. Let's see. Again, folks.
Indeed. It's a nice breakfast lunch, right? Like we're having our coffee, Falcon 9's having it, so all's good.
The Lox milkshake, you know?
The
Exactly.
Lox milkshake. Nice. Something about like a Lox Frappuccino, or can I say that on stream? I don't know if that's like a copyrighted thing or not. Anyways, insert favorite coffee drink name here. I don't even actually know where that came from, like either French or what. Let's see. Again, trying to get some more questions here before we get too close to the launch. That's one of the things we do. We like to answer questions, give a little bit of interactivity for people watching the stream. Sort of feels weird to say that yes, now we will give you some interactivity, stream. Continue asking us questions so that we can interact with each other. Let's see. So here's a recent news thing. Any idea about how SpaceX is working to make Starlink more secure or its potential vulnerabilities? That was an interesting tweet from Elon the other day where he actually said that they would be redirecting some focus, I guess, to making Starlink more secure. I figured it would already be secure in the first place. Sort of a reactive tweet from Elon there. Do we know anything else about that?
The one only hint we got was through another tweet where he mentioned that Starlink signals were being jammed, referring to its use in Ukraine during the ongoing Russian invasion. Saying that Starlink signals had been jammed there, but they were able to successfully work around it with some software changes, not hardware changes, which is very impressive. So I would imagine that the ongoing efforts are likely software based, just based on that tweet. But other than that, we don't have a whole lot more details. We've gotten this question before, are the launch plans being adjusted at all? And I do not believe that would be the case. Ukraine falls within the latitudes that these standard shells are reach. And so they don't need to, target a new shell to get extra access to Ukraine. The shells that they have already been launching to are the ones that service Ukraine most easily. So launch plans are likely not changed as a result of the Ukraine crisis going on right now. And it doesn't sound like hardware changes to the satellites are being made. Sounds like some software things are being worked. Elon did also mention that this is basically free QA, free quality assurance, and actually helping them improve the system, which obviously under these circumstances not what the world is looking for, but I guess one silver lining to what's going on right now. Starlink hopefully providing some much needed communication services to that region.
Yeah, I think we've
Indeed. I think
Go ahead,
the other
Chris.
thing the other thing to that sort of caught my eye that I'm interested in what you all were thinking is he did mention that this would cause minor delays for both Starlink and Starship. And that's what sort of caught me out, like the delays to Starship. Like, is it a personnel reshuffle issue, like moving personnel over to fix the Starlink part of it, so therefore Starship is delayed, or did this reveal something about Starship as well that they wanted to stop and fix from a quality assurance? The Starship reference was odd to me in that, and in terms of how a Starlink software thing would delay Starship.
Although, now that we bring that up again, and based on what we've seen out of Boca Chica the last couple days, it is worth noting that we saw what appears to be a Starlink deployment structure of some kind added to Ship 24 down in Boca Chica, and it is possible that some sort of test regarding Starlink deployment is actually going to occur fairly early in the SpaceX Starship test campaign, which could mean that simply some upgrades or changes that are being made to Starlink overall might affect very early Starship test flights, because they plan to incorporate some of those testing with Starlink payloads on those missions, based on what we saw in Boca Chica the last couple of days. So maybe that's what he was referring to.
And
Again, the tweet was pretty vague, but.
And he made reference to the Starlink version 2s going on
Yes.
on Starship as well. So maybe that has something to do with it as well, that it's something with the version 2s. Yeah, good point. Good point.
Interesting. It seems like if there's any way that the Starlink could delay Starlink could delay Starship. Jeez, come on, SpaceX. Apparently they're fans of stars. It seems like that might be some sort of physical change. Like I could see a physical change to the satellites causing changes to the deployment mechanism or something with Starship. But if they're fixing things with software, I don't see how that affects SpaceX Starship unless they don't want to launch it until the Starlink satellites are fixed. But they're launching Starlink satellites right now. So I don't really see how all that fits together.
It could be something that affects specifically Starlink version 2, that they want to hold off on those launches until some software gets changed or whatever. Or, obviously if it's a hardware fix, that makes a lot more sense. But yeah, so it's interesting. We'd definitely like to hear more about what exactly is entailed there. But I also do think the idea of simply some software and, RF people from the Starship program are being refocused on Starlink for a near-term thing could also be what he meant, rather than actual hardware effects.
Right, that makes sense. It's an interesting thing to think about, and not really the type of thing to laugh about. I mean, Elon says, it's free QA, and that's not really the way we want to get free QA on it, or any sort of QA on it. But interesting that they were sort of having to make some changes there to solve some problems that I guess normally in a peaceful world you wouldn't think you'd have to deal with, people tracking or targeting or jamming Starlink satellite uplinks.
But I do want to sort of stop real quick, just really quick, because, like we talked about this in terms of Ukraine, right? And seeing how quickly they can deploy assets, and Elon talking about how they had been working with regulatory bodies. They were sort of close to getting something for operations in Ukraine, and then this kicked off, and obviously that went forward. But it's also worth pointing out, like with what we've seen in Ukraine, with what we saw in Tonga when the volcano erupted earlier this year. What we're seeing with this ability, Starlinks, OneWeb will get there eventually too, as they keep launching. We'll have to wait and see what their launch schedule ends up being. But this is what we were talking about what this sort of space-based internet could be, and bringing it to these very remote places in the world, or places that are under siege or have experienced natural disasters. We are watching this system sort of work in the flexibility that it was designed to, in order to be able to bring this communication where it's needed. And I think that's a very important part when talking about not just the Starlink constellation, but the others that we have planned, as to what they can truly enable us to do and communicate with very, very quickly.
All right, I have to ask.
Yeah.
The units that went to Ukraine, do people have to pay for those?
Doubtful in this situation.
Yeah, did he say whether they were just active and free for use, or
unless
the Ukrainian government
or US
like
military.
paid Yeah, it's possible that the Ukrainian government paid like some flat rate for a bunch of units, and but I don't think they're charging individual users.
I didn't see any information like that. Like,
Oh yeah,
I saw one truck that had a couple Starlinks in it, and then it's turned on in Ukraine, and there was no, like, are people ordering these? Like, how do you get a Starlink? Are they being deployed? Like, how are they actually being deployed? I never saw any of that information, how they were actually going out. Certainly they're being deployed in some useful manner, and it's not like, use the internet that doesn't work to sign up for Starlink service that you'll get in 6 months, like the status is over here right now. 6 months if you're lucky. All right, let's continue on here. We're under 10 minutes. It's 9 minutes and 56 seconds now. So let's get a couple more super chats.
Yeah.
Smooth Juice says, morning, guys, or should I say afternoon. Hope it goes to plan and we get some good sounds too. Smooth Juice, we've already answered the last part of your questions. The 4 towers are for Christmas decorations. During Christmas time, they actually hang lights on them to make the launch pad SLC-40 look more festive. I made that up. It's for lightning. Let's see.
I think that we should continue just to make up as many different answers to that question as we can.
Wrong answers only. Like, here is one. Graham says, why do they still paint Falcon 9 as it only lasts one launch? It was an interesting thing to say, lasts one launch. It adds extra weight and cost. Thomas, why would they paint a rocket if the paint, I think it lasts more than one launch. It gets dirty, but it doesn't mean that the paint has gone away and no longer protects the rocket, right?
Yeah, so the paint does actually serve a purpose as far as just protecting the metal underneath. I don't, off the top of my head, not sure if it's sometimes it's an electrostatic thing where the paint is actually made of a material that helps conduct electricity should the rocket get struck by lightning or something like that in flight, or just discharging the static as it goes through clouds or whatever. Sometimes that's a thing, but sometimes the main metal body of the rocket can do that just fine. So other times the paint can act as a corrosion protection for the metal that's underneath. There are other purposes that the paint actually serves rather than just looks. And so I would imagine that is the real purpose behind painting Falcon 9. Of course, if you look at Starship, you notice that they're not painting Starship. So clearly the stainless steel assembly is sufficient on its own there. It's also, actually, it's a bit of a thermal thing as well. White painted structures will absorb less heat, which is good for spaceflight applications, especially when it's a tank holding very cold propellants on board. That's why when we talk about Starship in the human landing system kind of application, where it won't re-enter and that paint won't get dirty from re-entry all the time, that Starship is still planned to be painted white for thermal reasons, most likely. So you still do see that used. It just depends on the application. And the Falcon 9 upper stage and first stage do actually still get painted. And but obviously, we see those boosters get scorchy, if you will, after a couple flights. The paint doesn't kind of go away; it just gets dirty, like Das said.
Yeah, I mean, just because it gets like sooty or whatever doesn't mean that the paint has completely ablated off the side of the rocket during the launch.
Right.
All right. Let's see. Here's a good question relevant to types of fuel being used. Ron Smith was asking, why does ULA fuel Atlas V with RP-1 days ahead of time while SpaceX does so on launch day?
I like this question. Yeah, this one comes down to the temperature of the propellant. So SpaceX chills down the RP-1 kerosene to make it more dense, to pack more into the rocket, get a little more energy. So they have to fuel it right away because it's chilled and you don't want it to warm up. So they have to fuel like this. But Atlas and ULA can fuel RP-1 kerosene into that rocket because it is ambient temperature. So they can just put it in there, and then kerosene is very, very stable. It needs an ignition source. It can't just spontaneously go boom. So it's actually very stable to just load it into the Atlas days ahead of time and leave it there because it's not going to boil off.
And also an added bonus, especially if they do it for some sort of wet dress rehearsal before the launch.
Yes.
They'll fuel, everything for the rehearsal, but then detank everything except for the RP-1 kerosene at that first stage, because it just so happens to lower the center of mass on the first stage, which means the rocket will be more stable as you roll it back and add the payload and things like that, and just reduces your wind constraints for rollback and rolling back out. So a little added benefit when they do those wet dresses.
All right. And Thomas, if you could you grab a couple of the last questions here for me while I jiggle a couple technical handles?
I absolutely can do that. Let's take a look here. Again, just coming up on 5 minutes to go for today's launch, and some other questions here. Stefan says, at T-minus 1 minute, Falcon 9 is in startup. Does that mean it has control over stage 0, like, for example, startup of water systems or stopping them in case of the abort? I believe that Falcon 9 is actually, those computers are the ones that command the release of the ground clamps. I believe Falcon 9 actually does that command because Falcon 9 is the one testing the health of all of its engines, which is what determines whether or not to launch in those last couple seconds. I don't know if the water system is controlled by the onboard computers or if that's a ground side computer. That's a very good question. I don't think we have an actual answer, though. I do believe that Falcon 9 commands the ground clamps, though. So that's a very good question. Let's see. We talked about how Starlink is becoming more secure. Let's see here. A good question from Matthew. How do they separate the fairings from the stages? Are they pyrotechnics? I believe there are no pyrotechnics involved. I believe SpaceX actually made a conscious effort to avoid that kind of thing. And the reasoning for that is you can't really test the same pyrotechnic charge that you're using on flight, because once you test a pyrotechnic, well, it fired, it's gone. You can't use that device anymore. So SpaceX has opted to, by the way, shout out to the fleet cam framing going on right now.
Yeah,
Very
sorry,
nice.
that's me. I'm doing it live.
Yeah, very good, very good. So you, in order to test pyrotechnics, you take a batch of the devices that you've ordered from your contractor or whatever. You test a subset of them, and if that subset works, then you assume the rest of the batch is also good. But that's not as reliable as if you use a pneumatic device, something that can be tested and then used exactly on the same flight. You can test that device, and if it works, you then install it on the flight vehicle, and it works again, right? So SpaceX has gone that route for a little bit more reliability, and thus the fairing separation event is a pneumatic device, not a pyrotechnic. And that actually clears out most of the question queue. We have a couple of super chats that have come through, and again, we're just under 3 minutes, so I'll speed run these really quick, and then we got to turn our attention towards liftoff here. Let's see. Harry Young says, been a bit since I got a birthday lunch. Have some cake. Harry, happy birthday, and thanks for the support. And Alan says, greetings from Ireland, glued to all launches at 92 years old. Alan, thank you so much for your support, and thanks for tuning in. Let's see here. Oh, and Shailene, thank you for your support and asking about what inclination means. So inclination, when we talk about the different orbits that Starship or Starlink, is going into, that is a result of the tilt of the orbit. Basically, what is the tilt of that orbit relative to the equator? Is it, a lower inclination means it is flying more closer to parallel to the equator versus a higher inclination as a more of a tilt to it. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about orbital inclination. But again, thank you to all the questions. We are under 2 minutes now, so we're going to go ahead and turn our attention towards Falcon 9, which is sitting fully fueled on the pad and on track to lift off with 48 new Starlink satellites in just under 2 minutes from now. Again, this launches from pad 40 at the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. A drone ship recovery is planned just about 8 minutes after liftoff for booster 1052 making its fourth flight. upper stage will continue on to orbit. There will be a coast
Thomas,
phase.
there is.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say.
There it is, a vent, that last event indicating that the final fueling has been completed.
Yes, that's what I was trying to say there as a cord came unplugged. But yes, from my angle, I am going to hop off comms, leave it for you for the initial ascent commentary, and rejoin you after stage step so I can get a track on this.
Sounds good, Chris. Good luck with the track today. Should be a gorgeous view of the launch. Less than a minute to go.
Indeed. Let's go Falcon 9.
Excellent. Good luck, Chris. Have fun out there. And Thomas, you're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed in the morning, so why don't you call the launch for us?
Okay. I don't know if I agree with that, but I'll give it a go. Coming up on 30 seconds to go here. Again, second stage will reach orbit just before that first stage landing. Again, about 8 minutes after launch, there will be a coast phase, and the deployment after a second burn will happen about an hour after launch. But we are going to be here for that early portion of the ascent, and that should start in just under 20 seconds here. Everything seems on track right now. 15 seconds to go for the Starlink Group 4-10 mission from Florida. 10 seconds. And standing by for stage 1 ignition. There it is, stage 1 ignition and liftoff of Falcon 9 from Space Launch Complex 40 with 48 new Starlink satellites headed to orbit. And let's listen in to the rumble.
Headed to the 2 Falcon 9 shot.
Yeah, you have to. Gorgeous shot.
Tell you what, Thomas, that's a good sounding broomstick.
It is indeed a very good sounding broomstick to us. See Falcon 9 punching through some clouds above Cape Canaveral there. That actually might be its own contrail because we had a pretty clear day. But Falcon 9 kind of obscuring itself, pulling a magic trick there. You can see the upper stage plume is starting to expand as it gets higher and higher in the atmosphere, less air pressure to contain that plume from the first stage engines. Flight appears to be going well so far. Coming up next is going to be main engine cutoff. The 9 engines on that first stage will shut down at the completion of the early ascent for today's flight, followed shortly after by stage separation and ignition of the Merlin vacuum engine on the upper stage. And that will leave the upper stage and its payload to proceed the rest of the way to orbit, and the first stage to return to a shortfall of gravitas for, again, its first ever drone ship landing for this particular booster. So coming up on that sequence now, there it is, main engine cutoff. You see the plume going away as the engines have shut down. Still got a view of the upper stage, and we just caught a glimpse there of the second stage engine igniting, Merlin vacuum engine now burning, and now a quick replay via the SpaceX feed, since a little bit of latency there, but there's some views of stage separation which has just occurred. And that upper stage ignition. Of course, the upper stage will power the payload all the way towards orbital velocity into low Earth orbit. Coming up on payload fairing separation, there it is. And you can see a stack of Starlink satellites bound for orbit. Meanwhile, the first stage has deployed its grid fins for aerodynamic control on the way back down, and that first stage is going to coast up to an apogee, or a highest point in its trajectory, and come back down for a drone ship landing after an entry burn and a landing burn.
Well, I have to say that because of the few clouds that it went by and through from our vantage point, the clouds that were moving and the rocket moving, it made it look like it was going extra fast.
You'd seen some ice tumbling off the bottom there, it looks like. Every now and then we see that, and of course, remember, ice does form on various parts of the rockets, and then when it starts flipping around here, maneuvering to re-enter, landing on the drone ship down there, you do get some pieces of ice that fly by. Every single video, it's like, did you see the UFO at 1846 or however minutes and seconds? And I guess it's just a way to drive engagement. UFO, where? Wow.
I like that. It's how SpaceX
drives
engagement.
Yeah. What did I say last time? There can be lots of UFOs if you're really bad at identifying flying objects.
Right, exactly.
Yes, exactly.
That's ice, folks. That's just pieces of ice.
But these side-by-side views are always great to provide that context of how much that second stage is still accelerating as the first stage moves its way back to Earth.
They're also worth mentioning the telemetry on the bottom part of the screen. First of all, great track by Chris on that early portion of the ascent. Well done, as always. And drawing our attention to the telemetry at the bottom of the stage, or bottom of the screen now, you can see that first stage is still actually coasting, actually just past apogee. It reached an apogee of about 135 kilometers, which is well into space, mind you. First stage does reach space, just not orbital velocity. And it's now on the way back down, and the next milestone for that stage will be the entry burn. You can see the grid fins deployed and some occasional RCS thruster firings to orient it properly for a re-entry. Also see a view up the inner stage just looking out into space, which is pretty cool. And then the upper stage you can see glowing red hot as it sort of ablatively cools itself as it burns. Again, that firing is nominal so far. Also well into space, over 100, coming up on 190 kilometers in altitude and over 11,000 kilometers per hour, so headed towards orbital velocity there.
Indeed, and that first stage is as it comes back down into the atmosphere, Thomas. You know, we talk a lot about the entry burn, and it's worth noting and really watching that velocity indicator on the first stage as well as the altitude. The entry burn is going to happen approximately 60 kilometers, give or take some, and then you will see the drop significantly and then continue to drop after that as the boosters in the dense lower atmosphere, so the aerodynamics are starting to slow it down as well.
Yep. Yeah, you see that altitude dropping, first stage about to cross, you know, depending on which demarcation of space you subscribe to, it is now undeniably back out of space and into the atmosphere.
The McDowell line. I want to call it the McDowell line.
Yeah, so we are below the McDowell line now, and the first stage getting ready for that entry burn in just a couple seconds here.
You can see its speed approaching 78 to 7,900 kilometers an hour.
And there is ignition of that entry burn. First the center engine, and now 2 additional engines. 3 engines firing for this entry burn. You can see that speed decreasing rapidly now. And this burn actually has 2 purposes. Not only does it slow it down, which reduces the aerodynamic stresses of re-entry, it also, the flame itself protects the rocket during that phase of re-entry. Kind of acts as a heat shield. But there you see shutdown of that entry burn, and you can see now some RCS thrusters firing and the grid fins starting to actuate as the stage now steers itself aerodynamically towards a shortfall of gravitas.
And note that velocity plummeting downward with no engines firing now. That's all the aerodynamic forces.
And those onboard cameras are having a rough time with all the aerodynamic forces and the re-entry. Hopefully we'll get those back. We should also get some views from the drone ship itself, however.
Don't jinx it, Thomas.
Yeah, don't jinx. Sorry, didn't mean to jinx it. Knock on wood.
We don't talk about the drone ship. It's shy. Go ahead, Chris.
And it's a shortfall of Gravitas and Doug that are out today
Yes.
for the recovery efforts in the Bahamas. Yes.
You can still see that stage 1 telemetry on the bottom left, still have that to give us an idea of how that stage is progressing. Coming up on touchdown of that first stage, which will precede upper stage shutdown by just a few seconds. Now, first stage less than 1,000 kilometers per hour. Meanwhile, the upper stage over 23,000 kilometers per hour. And that first stage landing burn should now be underway. Hoping for a soft touchdown on the drone ship. There is a view from the drone ship, briefly. And there's that live telemetry view. We'll stand by for confirmation of landing. Should get that in a few seconds here, hopefully. But it does look like the upper stage has reached its initial parking orbit successfully, which is, of course, the primary objective for the mission.
I think the booster may have ended up going back to the metric future. The last telemetry we got was 88 kilometers per hour.
Yeah, that wasn't great not seeing a booster standing on the drone ship there, but we'll wait for SpaceX's confirmation one way or another of what happened. It's not unheard of to lose contact with the drone ship, but to see a picture of it with no booster after the scheduled landing, we'll have to wait and get that confirmation from SpaceX. But until then, that's pretty much what we've got for this moment right now, because there's going to be a short 1 second refiring of the second stage engine here about an hour after liftoff to finalize the orbit at 305 by 317 kilometers for the deployment. And then the deployment will actually happen outside of ground tracking range, so we will be getting social media confirmation. We'll be getting confirmation from SpaceX over later on today about that deployment of the Starlink satellites.
Yeah, we're still up, and we have confirmation of a successful landing. There we go. Thank you, Michael, for listening into that. So a bit of a late confirmation, but that's happened before. Hopefully we'll get some images shortly here. Usually the camera feed does come back eventually, but SpaceX does confirm the first stage landing was successful. So 1052, a veteran of 3 returned to launch site landings, but now has made its first drone ship landing. And there it is.
And there it is.
All
okay,
right.
Good.
Kept us in suspense there for a little while.
Yeah, just got to add a flair for the dramatics. Nothing wrong with that.
Well, you know, it wanted to go on a vacation to the Caribbean, and it wanted us to be nervous about it.
See some water spraying on the deck there, and got a little bit of a rainbow even. Look.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Look.
Everything's fine in a drone ship land, folks. There's rainbows and everything.
But there you have it. So a successful early portion of the flight, but like Chris mentioned really quickly here before we have to wrap up, that second stage is going to be on a coast phase for about 40 or 50 minutes or so. And then there'll be a brief upper stage burn, and then just over an hour after liftoff, the T plus an hour, there will actually be spacecraft deployment. And so we're going to stand by for confirmation of that from SpaceX via their social media channels. But that, I believe, is going to do it for our live coverage of today's mission. Going well so far, just waiting for that final deployment. Chris G, thank you so much for rolling out there so we could see not only the launch itself, but DAS's favorite launch day view, an empty launch pad.
Indeed.
That's what I like to see.
I had that queued up as soon as I lost it visually. DAS's favorite shot. But yes, my absolute pleasure being out here today, like always. And we'll stand by for that successful deployment of the Starlinks. Now over 2,000 up there, which is the first constellation to reach this. Weren't we saying a little bit earlier, Thomas, right?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thomas, you doing the outro or am I?
Coolio.
You started
it's all you, Das.
Well, folks, like Thomas said, out in the field we had Mr. Chris Gebhardt with the fantastic track today. Chris, thank you so much for rolling out and getting us that view. And like Thomas said, my favorite view here of the empty launch pad after the launch. There's Chris's Twitter in chat if you want to toss him a follow. ChrisG_NSF, way easier to click the link. Nobody has ever gone to twitter.com and typed in ChrisG_NSF after I said it out loud on a stream. I would be willing to make that bet. Just click the link that's in chat. Also, helping out in the field, we had Mr. Stephen Marr. You're going to also want to toss a Twitter follow to Stephen because he's going to be posting up some shots from the launch. He was doing some still photos today. I'm pretty sure he was doing some still photos. At least he was out there and had cameras, and I assume that's what happens. So make sure you toss him a follow as well. There's the link in chat. Also, if you want to support what Steven does, he sells some really cool prints over on SmugMug. He's got that website there, and you can click to buy some art for your wall if you'd like to decorate your wall with flaming rockets and things flying through the sky. Steven, thank you so much. No, you're not on comms, but we appreciate you rolling out. Also in the studio with us, we had Mr. Thomas Berghardt. Thomas, thank you so much. I was going to say for the help this morning, but you were carrying the torch there for a while. I appreciate the help, man.
Oh, no worries whatsoever. Always a pleasure to be on the live coverage and looking forward to the next opportunity to do so.
Excellent. Thomas is, of course, the news director for NASA Spaceflight. You can see his Twitter there in the links. Click on TG Metsfan 98 and toss him a follow for breaking news and our articles and things like that. I know he does an awful lot of work making sure that our articles get ticking along like they should. So if you're more of a reading sort of person, you can head on over and get up to date on everything that's happening in space with the articles. We don't mention articles very much, so I figured I'd give him a little bit more time there.
We appreciate that, Das.
You know, you got to read the articles. Like, how do you think I know what's going on before I start running my mouth on the launch here? I just try to skim through the articles so I can talk about what's going on. And then lastly, folks, from the studio, my name is John Galloway with NASA Spaceflight. If I can find my own name in the list, there we go, I can click on it, and it'll display my information up there in the corner as well. If you want, you can continue watching what's going on by hopping over to our Fleet Cam. Again, that is our 24/7 camera that's out at Port Canaveral's partnership with Rusty's Seafood and Oyster Bar. It's actually a view that you can get if you visit Port Canaveral in person. You can sit there on the deck and have some fried alligator. I think that's actually a thing. And sit there and watch launches and watch boosters get processed. That booster's still being processed there, so we expect to see legs folded up. The booster leaned over horizontally. They'll put it on a transporter, and they'll roll it back for another flight. And then in a couple days here, expect to see the booster that just landed come back into port. We'll see them come in on shortfall of gravitas. The tugs dock it over there against the side. The crane will hook up to it, and they'll process it because that's SpaceX's thing. They reuse the boosters, and by seeing what's going on at Port Canaveral, you can keep track of exactly how they do that. But like Thomas was mentioning earlier, that is going to bring us to the end of our live launch commentary today. We appreciate everybody for showing up. Thank you as well for the support. If we missed you, we didn't mean to, but we always, always, always appreciate the people who make it so that we can continue doing what we do. And for now, we will go ahead and see you nerds later. Thanks so much for watching.
We have liftoff. Propulsion continues to be normal.
RCP chamber pressure looks good. Toggling up. Roger roll, Atlantic.
Water towers can fly! Yes!
Echo Delta nominal.
Fighting outside SC off. Bring in SC off.
Yikes. You bet. Concur. We don't need any more of these.